I got my swag on
Oh,
here from
nice.
the conference.
Nice. Repping Unchained. All right. Well, Liam, we're live, man. Thanks
Yeah, good to meet
for
you.
coming on and having a chat.
Absolutely, I'm a fan. So
Well, thanks, man. This came about because I tweeted out a few weeks ago, as I like to do and have been doing. Well, as a result of that tweet, I guess I've done a bunch lately, but it's just so great. I mean, most of us know by now that Bitcoiners are awesome, right? They're the people that you want to hang out with and have conversations with and figure shit out with. And
yeah,
you hit me up and said you'd be down to jump on a call, and you sent me a message about how you've been thinking about proof of work and how you're seeing it kind of everywhere you look these days. So I thought that was reason enough to get together and have a chat.
yeah. And proof of work is it's kind of a big, like it's a first principles things, I guess, but it's really big. And it kind of is one of the main differentiators between like a fiat, fake thing and a real thing. Um, so that's been just kind of like fodder for introspection. Because that was a new concept to me. I'd never considered proof of work, you know? And then when I dived into hearing how like every Bitcoin had to be discovered or mined, right? You know, none were kind of thrown out there. And then you start thinking, well, everything of value needs work, right? Like a house, to build a house, it needs work. Um, really, and I know I mentioned rock walls, like just anything, anything engineered, it takes time and energy for it to manifest. So that's just kind of an interesting lens to look at things. And that's been part of why I'm a little altered. So I've been into Bitcoin maybe for 2 years now. And I kind of wanted to ask you, how long have you been in the space?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got some more questions for you based off that, but
Okay.
the general story is basically I'd been following it for a long time. Like I don't remember exactly what year this was right now, but I remember when it hit like parity with the US dollar. So it hit like $1 per Bitcoin, and it was like kind of a big deal at the time.
Yeah.
And I wasn't, and I was so ideologically aligned with what it represented. I just didn't have the faith that it could persist and become what it was aspiring to become at the time, right? And so I was gold bug at the time and thought like gold was the answer, albeit a very imperfect one. And then I kept watching, and my first exposure was to Andreas. And like I think another one of these plebcasts I did a few days ago, I'm not sure who it was, but they said the same thing where it was, I mean, I understood a lot of the subject matter that Andreas was talking about, but there was some technical aspects that I couldn't really follow him on. But the sincerity by which he spoke was the thing that most made me pay attention. Because you listen to all sorts of people on YouTube. And
Yeah.
I remember back in the day, you had the anarchists and the gold people and these people and the doom and gloom, like next year, this is when it happens. It all melts next year. And there was always like they were a little bit too into their own persona, or they were a little too egotistical, or they weren't humble enough or whatever. And in Andreas, I just saw someone that seemed to be doing their best to speak as truthfully as they could about something that they felt was deeply meaningful, and that rubbed off on me. And then anyways, long story short, I had I was like, okay, this is definitely worth investigating, but it was a bit of legwork to acquire some at the time. And, I guess I'm a lazy person, so I didn't put in the legwork. And then I was on a trip in Bali, and I can't remember, it was 14 or 15. I think it might've been 2015. And they actually had a physical store there. And that's when I went in and picked up my first Bitcoin. And, it's been a
Wow.
very interesting journey ever since.
Well, if you're ideologically already aligned, then you're way ahead of me, because I was just like a normal person believing the narrative until 2 years ago. So
What happened? I mean,
yeah.
how did, because if it was a more dramatic shift, I'm always interested in hearing the stories about how the shift occurred.
Okay. So I don't know if you remember, when the volcano was going off on the big island of Hawaii, like it was just like 2.5 years ago, I think. And like a whole town got wiped out. And I was following this guy who was like live posting videos of these raging rivers of lava. And so it's totally chance, okay? Because one time it wasn't even Twitter, I wasn't even on Twitter, it was Facebook. And one day, you know, in amongst the lava, the amazing lava videos this guy was posting, or lava as we used to say in Canada, he posted like, oh, if anybody is interested in Bitcoin, now would be a good time to get in. I think the price dropped from 12,000 to 8,000 or something. So I was like, I think it had popped into my ears, you know, randomly in 2 or 3 places, but very minimally. Like I remember, what is that? It's like scam money, you know, the classic initial bullshit that you hear. So that's when I started, but I didn't know anything about wallets, the blockchain, or whatever. And so I guess it was just all you podcasters. Literally, I spent, you know, more than an hour a day for a year listening. Stefan Livera, you know, Marty Bent, Andreas, and then you would be like the more philosophical world kind of a thing. So yeah, it's taken a while, but I'm a curious person. So as soon as I got latched onto it, I was like, holy shit, this is so fucking cool. And, you know, and it was so weird. It's so weird, right? It's like, it's really strange. And then there's kind of a lot of generosity in all of it. The open source nature, you know, all the wallet stuff it's freely. So in Buddhism, which I've been like a light follower of, there's this notion of things that are freely offered. The Buddhist teachings are freely offered, and then you're encouraged to support your teachers in however way you feel is appropriate. But so much of this ecosystem of Bitcoin was just being freely offered. I just, you know, when we're in such a world that's very controlled and gate kept, and, you know, subscription fees for this. And so it was just, you know, I'd never heard of GitHub. So that was a whole thing. The open source world was just kind of like, wow, these people are literally committing thousands of hours of work, and it's all freely offered. So yeah, I'm kind of babbling, but
no, babble away. But like, were you put off initially because a lot of people, especially these days, because back in 2015, well, first of all, like Bitcoin Twitter wasn't as big and a going concern as it is now. And so that, like, there wasn't so much to put you off of Twitter if you were a sensitive sort of type, and the laser-eyed folk, for whatever reason, might offend your sensibilities. Let's put it that way. And so was there any aspect of that, like coming in, where you got on Twitter and you're like, what the fuck is going on here? Look, what is all this craziness that's happening?
Like, you must be talking about American HODL.
Well, you know, what everyone is like,
yeah,
you know, on Twitter. It's a madhouse in many ways.
I just got to put it out there. Who doesn't love American HODL? Like, he's got a good heart, right?
He does.
No, but that was part of it. Like, all the characters, you know, like I have a theater background, so who doesn't love wacky characters? I mean, come on. But even in all of these wacky characters, there's this through line of incisive wisdom, you know, and like clearing out the fog of narratives to get to, you know, like mathematical truth or whatever, philosophical, self-evident truth. That that was everywhere I looked, essentially. And I agree with you, Antonopoulos, great speaker, very clear communicator, and powerful persuader. So yeah, the Twitter gang I kind of loved, and I live on Maui, which is fairly isolated intellectually, and so I was just like, oh, this is so cool. And then also COVID kind of put a little microscopic focus on that, and they kind of became, like a community. I'm just a lurker, but still, I'm like, it was so weird going to the Bitcoin conference and seeing all these people and going, oh my God, there's whatever. It's just like seeing these people in person and seeing Foss like blow up on stage, and but it must be weird for you guys because you are kind of like, Bitcoin celebrities, but you don't know the plebs, right?
What do you mean know them? Like,
Well, like there's
personally?
there's just so many people watching you, so it's that whole celebrity weirdness of where your face is in front of thousands and thousands of people, but you don't know them.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful from my perspective because I don't know what it's like to be, and celebrity might not be the right word, but I know what you mean. Like by virtue of the fact that some of us produce content or are, we're more known than a lurker, for example. But so I don't know what it's like to be that in a different capacity, like in Hollywood or in whatever. But here, I mean, it's just authenticity is like the main thing here, like being true to yourself and being true to your intellectual pursuits and being truthful in your speech to the extent that you can. Like that seems to be one of the highest values that's permeating this group of people that are coalescing. And what's awesome about that is like, it means you just get to be yourself. And so if when I would, like at the conference, when people would come up to me and want to say hi or thank you or what have you, like they know what I'm about already. And that means like we can just fast forward like all through them getting to know what I'm about. And then by virtue of the fact that like we're so, if you're like a crazy Bitcoiner maximalist sort of person, like you already de facto know that you line up on certain like core values, really, like core values of truth and freedom and fairness and this kind of stuff. And so it's all like, and I've joked about this before with like some of the guys on the Hangout, but within, I mean, sometimes it's instant. Like someone will come up and be like, hey, I just wanted to say thank you. And like within 2 seconds of just noticing their vibe, I'm like, we're homies now. And, it's all like hugs and cool. And then it's just a matter of like, there's so much going on that you don't have enough. Like, I wish there was more time to hang out with everybody, right? Because everyone's so great, and cool and smart and humble, and it's just an awesome group of people. And so it's that, for that reason, it's very cool, like the quote unquote celebrity aspect of all this. Because to me, like relationships are, I guess, the most valuable thing in life. Even beyond Satoshi's even. And especially when the relationships where both parties are sincerely being themselves and you line up on the values that you hold most dearly, and you get to have great conversations and you get to build trust and you get to, just enjoy different experiences together. I mean, it's beautiful. And the fact that by virtue of doing this, like now I can extend my best friend group from like 5 people to 50 or 500 people. It's like, it's such a blessing.
It is. And it's kind of, I remember listening to a conversation you had with someone where you were talking about religion and how Bitcoin, it really is a religion, and not in the negative sense of that word, but like I wasn't much of a church person until I came to Maui, and this really sweet family invited me to church once because I was their piano teacher. And, being like a gay guy, you're kind of like, I don't want to go to church, just because like gay, typically gays in church are kind of like, oh, and but it was a really cool church. It wasn't an anti-gay church or anything. And I got to
Right.
see the affinity that they all had. So it was like the church, rather than serving a purpose of, pounding the Bible, it was like a weekly gathering of community members. And you'd be like, oh, Auntie needs help. She broke her hip, so can somebody go get her food? And so in that way, I think Bitcoin is like that. Like it's such a clear and focused set of values that are based off mathematics, I guess, and truth. And we live in a world that's so full of delusion and obfuscation and manipulation, that you're kind of like, oh, we've reached the promised land because other people are seeing this the way I see it.
Mm-hmm.
And the mainstream media would not have you believe that other people see things. So yeah, I get it. I get the fervor and the zealotry behind it. And I think we have to be aware of that, so as not to, like scare people off, because you can get a little too really it's excitement, and it's authentic excitement, but it can come off as like, whoa.
Yeah. Well, I talk a lot, of course, lately about, the deeper aspects of Bitcoin and philosophy and its relation to religion and the overlap and all that kind of stuff. But it's really interesting that, as you say, I mean, people are converging on this, but the values are implicit. In religion, they're explicit. It's like, these are the core values and this is how you should be thinking about it. And if you agree, perhaps you become part of the community or the religion or whatever. But with Bitcoin, it's like a shelling point for values. It's like people are seeing themselves without anybody explicitly or dogmatically telling them anything about what it is. They're coming to appreciate it for what it is, and they're noticing that other people are doing the same thing, and they're converging on it on that basis. And I think that's
organically.
And it's super unique. And to the point about overdoing the excitement, I mean, I'm definitely guilty of that sometimes, but I'm not sure it's a bad thing. Like, first of all, I'm not afraid of scaring anybody off in Bitcoin, because, my opinion has always been like, if your search for truth, or if your curiosity, shall we say, is so susceptible to being thrown off course by either mean people on the internet or crazy people on the internet, then maybe you're not ready to, maybe the pursuit isn't that genuine. Maybe you're not that dedicated to the pursuit, because for me, like, I don't care if someone's mean or nasty or overdoes it. I mean, I'm best friends with Eric Kasem, for example, and like at the Bitcoin conference, like, he's just arms flailing, like he's yelling at like 5x the necessary volume, and he's saying all sorts of crazy shit. And I'm just standing next to him, like, loving it and seeing people's reactions to it. So right. I think, what's beautiful about this is, one, we are converging, as I said, but two, everyone is still able to digest it and express it in whatever way they think is right and true. And then if we all do that, then we'll probably end up, by virtue of our interactions and observations of one another, kind of continue to refine our understanding of what this thing and what the appropriate response to it is or should be, and should it be more zealous, or should it be more reserved? And like, we only kind of going to figure that out if we try it, right? We have examples of approaching it that way, and we see which ones resonate with us, and on we move.
Yeah. And also Bitcoin doesn't care about our zealotry, which is great.
And I think it's great because obviously it's the case that in the modern era, and maybe this has always been the case, I mean, culture has always served to restrain our behavior to a certain degree so that we can, get along with everybody else and coordinate our activities and stuff like that. But the benefit of fuck you money, of having your life force stored in a way that nobody can fuck with it, nobody can distort it, steal it, etc., is that individuals are set free. You're more free to be yourself because you're less susceptible to somebody, doing something to you that's going to restrict or restrain your potential in the future, right? Whether it's because
Right.
they're going to fire you from your job, they're going to shut off your bank account, they're going to inflate your money, all that goes away. And so what's super interesting, maybe even the most interesting thing about this phenomenon, is that we are going to see what it's like when humans have available to them a form of freedom that they've never had available to them before in human history. And what does that mean for how people shrug off the strictures, the overbearing strictures of culture or interpersonal rules, let's say, and become a higher version or a more truthful or sincere version of what they are, or can even discover about what they are and what they want to express and what they want to become. And I'm sure that's going to mean there's a lot of like wacky stuff that's going to emerge from that, because it's by no means like a clear path of like, how do you express who you truly are when you're granted a form of freedom that you've never had to engage with or consider before. But ultimately, of course, I think it's a good thing, because the more freedom, the better.
Yeah. And didn't Breedlove write an article about how Bitcoin was like a gay pride? Like the early stages of Bitcoin are like the early gay pride parades where the people were just going bonkers because it was their first taste,
Yeah.
and it wasn't in a derogatory way at all. It was like the when you release and what you were saying is like, you become who you naturally are, like without these shackles of ideations of societal or religion or whatever kinds of energetic shackles we might bear. As we drop those shackles, we're going to be dancing in the streets, and that could be weird. That could be different for everyone, how we dance in the streets. But I loved when I think it was Robert Breedlove who mentioned, like, when you finally see the light, and because it is kind of a mind blower to have everything that you thought about how the world works unravel or be laid bare, right? The manipulation. I think Jeff Booth just tweeted the most powerful thing yesterday about the fact that your real estate value can be essentially controlled by a man who changes an interest rate, on a dial. It is not a market. It's a control system,
Totally.
So when those onion layers fall away, then we do have to dance in the streets. And I do think you're right. It's kind of an interesting paradox that this mathematical system, which I've always tried to tell people, it's like Bitcoin has been released into the wild, and it's out there like an element, like it's like oxygen in the atmosphere. It's there. So, but the paradox is how that system could enable what you talked about, is people becoming their authentically, deeply, unfucked with true selves, which is a natural thing. Like animals in nature or plants in nature, they live by the laws of nature, but they don't live by morality structures that have been imposed.
Mm-hmm.
Or just other inputs, societal inputs.
Yeah. And, it's also the case, I think, as you mentioned, when people get into Bitcoin and they realize how fundamental money is and how it affects and influences to a large degree the various institutions and cultural norms. Like, so much is downstream of money, right? And so when you replace the base layer, you have to reconstruct your view of pretty much everything, politics, money, economics, government, culture, beauty, art, like it all is on the table for reconstruction. But that also means that you kind of, if the context by which you even perceive yourself in relation to, which is how we perceive ourselves, is so dramatically changed, then how you see yourself is going to be different. And so what I find super interesting is that, we construct our identity via the conditioning we receive from our family and our country and our culture and that kind of stuff, and all the different signals we get from the culture that we operate in. It constitutes what we think is, our potential and who we are, and so much. And when the culture and all those signals become replaced by ones that we think perhaps are more truthful or more fair or more liberty oriented, I think we have to reconstruct ourselves in many ways. We have to say, like, oh,
Right.
like I constructed myself based on all these different signals that are different, or all these signals that are different now. And so what does, like you said, we're free to be ourselves, but in many cases, because of the way that society and culture works, and you go to school and you're influenced by these things and you're told these are the career path options and this is the life options.
Yeah.
When all that changes, I mean, you're very much confronted with the notion of like, well, who even am I really that I want to express? Like, I mean, what is most true about me now that I have the freedom, or generating more and more of the freedom to actually express it? And that's by no means an easy answer for a lot of people, especially those that are coming out of an era of such divergence, signaling and conditioning from society and culture. And so, again, to your point about maybe the first response is just this explosion of exuberance because things have been held down for so long. And like, maybe we're in the period where it's just like, bang, like who gives a fuck, right? We just got to celebrate and try and all that kind of stuff. And maybe in a few decades or generation or 5 years, who knows, it'll settle down and people will have the necessary information and the necessary examples in other people of how to reconstruct things to orient themselves in a way that they think is both proper and true to themselves in this new world that's emerging as a result of the base layer having changed. But, it's so early in this process that I think, all of our software, as it were, like all of our kind of consciousness are being reconstructed or reoriented to around what this technology means for the world, and as a result, our relationship to it.
Yeah, and people can be scared of that. That can be a scary thing.
Oh yeah.
To just be to have everything be like, oh, wow, it's like, oh, it's a new world now. How do we be, like you're saying, how do we do this?
Well, it's like you shake up the Etch-a-Sketch, right? It's like you have this big complex thing and then you just shake it up. It's like, all right, it's empty now. And I mean, this is why the analogy to like something like ego death, whether it be from psychedelics or from near-death experiences or from trauma of various kinds, is so apt, because it's kind of that process of you like being stripped bare and now beginning the process of reconstruction around signals or information that is more valid or more true. And has greater options available to you. It's like
a psychic reprogramming, essentially.
Yeah.
And or hopefully, programming is a scary word, but it's like a psychic rebuilding from nothing, potentially. And that's where like there's some cool intersections with Buddhism, because humans, I think the plague of humans is this fixation with view, like attachment to view or belief. View is like a milder word than belief, but people are so, people just cling to their views so strongly. And I think that's one thing that Bitcoiners are good at is, like, oh, well, hold on, allowing myself to question my own view, because that's the only way things can evolve is without rigid clinging to view. So
I totally agree, and I think simultaneous to that, they also recognize that you can't just be like an open membrane to any old view. And so I think this is part of the thing that inspires so many of us to make sure like we ain't no slouches in the areas that we're
Right.
relying on our views, right? Be it economics or history or philosophy or psychology. Like we want to make, like, I think we're all very receptive to being like, we'll swap out a view if we confront one that's more rational or logical or reasonable or more valid, but you're going to have to push me off of it. Like, I'm not just going to lay down and allow you to insert that different view, you know? And I think that's the
Right.
way it should be, of course.
Yeah. And the amount of time that you dig into a story can also, and there's proof of work, right? Let's say I read a headline, I'm like, oh, you know, Bitcoin uses too much energy or whatever, and then I can hold that view. I haven't done any of the work to investigate that view, right? So that's obviously, I'm preaching to the converted, but that's why society is so fucked up, because there's no investigation and beyond, there's no work being done. But as you say, the views that we may have should be views that are well researched and well seasoned, let's say, and tested. And so, and I enjoy that process. As an example, a view that I might have had 5 years ago is like, oh, Democrats are great, Republicans are greedy, or just what, like one of those stupid political polarity views, right?
Right.
And then, like I have friends that say the word Republican like it's a mean term or something. Like, it's just so weird to go beyond, to go beyond an identity. And so that's another gift that the Bitcoin community has brought me, is 5 years ago, I might not have listened to anything somebody said if they identified as a Republican or whatever, which is so, that's talk about rigidity and not allowing, critical thinking into a view being held, right? I had a view that was not perforatable, whatever, and so when you open yourself up to critical thinking and free thinking, then first of all, you probably would not cling to an identity anymore, which I don't cling to. But then you can just stick to facts, so you can drop the tribalism and dive in and do the work. So we're back to proof of work. You do the work to assemble your view, and I think a wise way to be is to hold that view. That view could always be reevaluated.
Totally agree. And I think that point you made about not holding on to a rigid identity, and of course the previously mentioned notion of ego death, or certain aspects of Buddhist philosophy very much expound upon that idea. One of the reasons why that's so valuable is because that allows you to remain humble enough to, when you encounter a different view or a different argument or whatever, be able to, let's say, maximally empathize with the person making the argument. Like, how could I come to view the argument the way they're viewing it? And what better way to truly assess which one is more valid than to be able to fully, basically to be able to steel man the other person's argument perfectly, to be able to get into that mindset. And so often today, whether it's on the right or the left, but obviously, I think it's a little bit more egregious on the left these days, where it's such a tell, that people are so rigidly hanging on to their identity, their ego, their ideology, that they lack the humility to do that. And so they just so hold on, and, they'll go down in a ball of flames holding on to, a nonsensical argument. And they'll also just egregiously mischaracterize the argument or dismiss the argument of the person that they're engaging with, as you said, because the requisite humility is not there to empathize sufficiently to understand the other person's argument, and then have the humility again to say, whichever one seems most valid to me, with a sincere attempt to discern the truest one is what I'm going to integrate into my perspective. And if it's theirs, so be it, because I'm better off, right? If I'm after the truth ultimately and the most truthful, valid perspective, then I don't care about winning or losing these little scrambles of arguments. I care about constructing the best perspective possible. And so, sure, I mean, maybe we're on different sides of whatever, but you made a better point here. And so I'm going to run with that and I'm going to integrate that. But, you know, that is at least in the public sphere, I mean, it's rare. But again, what's so awesome about this budding Bitcoin culture that we participate in is that seems to be the norm, right? Not the exception.
Yes. And an interesting point about those people that close off the other view and then they move to dehumanize that person with the opposing view is that's the essence of hatred. That's like if you really go down to it, that's how the Holocaust happened. It's basically I've seen it with the way dehumanization is used in the mainstream media, where instead of listening to someone's view, they get blocked off and labeled, and that's the end of it. And then those label. So Jordan Peterson is kind of a good example of that, where I'm like, why are people so mad at Jordan Peterson? I keep, I spent about an hour and a half trying to find anything mean that he said. He's not like, when I listen to him, I'm like, there's nothing mean about this guy at all. Everything he says is very considered. It's I
mean, for fuck's sake, most of the time he's just crying about how powerful the experiences of gratitude he's having are, right? He's just there weeping and on all of his videos.
But then, I literally went to see show me an example of him saying, something awful about trans people or whatever. And then I found all these CBC headlines of this university refuses to have Jordan Peterson, known misogynist or whatever. And I'm like, well, please, can somebody help me understand where this comes from? And then when you actually do the work and find the interview and you watch the interview and it's like, no, that's not what he said. And that's not, that he didn't have any mean intention, as far as I can see. There's only a generous intention, right? I mean, I think anybody would be, well, Liam, here, check out, because sometimes people are mean, they're really mean and they're really fucked up, but you see it, you can find the clip or you can find something. Yeah. So anyway, but my point about when people are shut away like that, I mean, that's how the Holocaust happens. So that's like hatred.
You mean in that like there's such a willingness to dismiss and discredit and cancel the other simply because they think differently than you, and that fact aggravates you or angers you in some way. Like, can you explain a bit more what you mean about how that leads to? Because it seems, I agree with you, it's like a spectrum, right? And it's not like they're materially different, but how do you see it moving along the spectrum?
Well, I think it's worse than that, because you don't even know that they have a different view than you, that you might have the same view that they have, but you've heard that they are a misogynist. So you don't even engage. It's like what you were saying, the only way to get to true evolved thought is to just drop the emotions and drop the story and engage. Hey, tell me about your view, and so we always wish politicians were like this, but they're not. I think maybe they used to be. Yeah. So at the point that you cut off, that you're not willing to read what someone wrote or watch listen to a podcast interview and listen to what they actually said, then you are basically in a state of delusion, and you are creating hatred. I mean, it might even be sort of homeopathic hatred, let's say, but that hatred can grow through more delusion. And so we're kind of saying the same thing, but without the perforation into the view and an open, rational discussion. And like you said, battle test my view, battle test your view, but as gentlemen, or like as a human that can respect another human, and God, if the one way the Buddhist teachings have helped me is to understand that everything that we are is from our entire lifetime of causes and conditions, of moment by moment by moment by moment, from the minute we're born till however old we are. Just think of the random inputs that we've had. Okay, so everybody has a full life of billions and billions of inputs that we have no idea about. Like, I have no idea, John, what your first 10 years of life were like, right? And you have no idea what the first 10 years of my life were like, and all those billions of moments and causes and conditions that shaped who we are. If we can all agree that we all have these billions and billions of conditions that form who we are, then may we not just be like, oh, okay, this person here, let me experience them. Let me honor that they've had a billion causes and conditions in their life. I've had a billion in mine. And so of course there are going to be differences, right? Of course there's going to be mental processes that move differently. But if you can just accept that everything is conditional, that in Buddhism they say it's lawful, which is weird, but like a person who we think is an asshole, we can say that asshole is lawful because their life has causes and conditions which have resulted in this assholism, right? That for whatever reason, that's the mode they need to survive, right? And so if we can see like, oh yes, that person's an asshole, I see that's lawful because that person has causes and conditions. And also it's my own story that they're an asshole, but you get the drift. Like, right. Whoever that person is, in my opinion, is lawful because of the causes and conditions of their entire life. So back to our point of hatred or whatnot, if you're going to just stop and cut yourself off from the reality that we all are lawful, then you're not playing, and you're hindering the process of intellectual evolution. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my point.
I agree, and I think it also speaks to, well, two things. One, like determining what your perspective should be is like number one goal of life and all religions and all philosophies. It's basically saying, okay, you seem to be a conscious human being in this reality. What should your perspective be? Like, what is the optimal way to view yourself, to view others, and to view the environment in which you're acting, such that you optimize all of those things? And what does optimization of those things even mean? Like, these are the biggest questions there are, right? And, there's a lot of really great attempts at answering them through the theological and philosophical literature. But I think, and the reason for that is because it's so important, because it's how you see the world, right? That whatever perspective you end up holding is what reality is to you. And I think what happens to these people that are, the ones that we've kind of been criticizing here, is that they're by virtue of the fact that that perspective, subconsciously they know how important it is for making sense and having a grip on the world, for feeling somewhat comfortable and secure in the chaotic world. That plus, I think they realize how tenuous that grip is, how fragile or vulnerable that perspective is. And you can take two approaches. You can take the first one we mentioned, which is, okay, it's vulnerable and there's no way to be certain about what the best is. So I'm going to commit myself to consistent and like eternal probing and upgrading and trying to refine that perspective such that I can map it as closely as possible to what is true. And maybe I never get there, but it's a hell of a valid enterprise as far as I can tell. Or I'm going to not going to embark on the hero's journey, as it were. And I'm going to say, okay, based on my conditioning and the ideologies I've been exposed to and whatever, this is the perspective I'm going to force through the world with. And everyone who doesn't conform to it doesn't belong in my world, as it were, to use somewhat dramatic language. And I'm going to exclude them as such. And, that exclusion may take the form of ignoring them, hating them, canceling them, or as you said, on that spectrum, killing them, just like they don't belong in my world. They can't be in my world. They're a threat to my world. They're a threat to how I see the world. And so I have to treat them as such. And, I think that perhaps that is partly what characterizes what's happening in the world today. And a question that I like to ask people if I, am engaging them, what's the right way to say it? If I'm engaging people that like are very disagreeable, let's say, or that aren't engaging in a fruitful or mutually humble way with me, and I ask myself this every day, and it directs a lot of my own pursuits at refining my perspective. But the question is, what makes you think your perspective is valid? Whatever your notion is, like if it's a political thing, if it's on COVID, if it's on whatever, like, because in the world today, like, and again, I'll generalize again, but people who watch like the mainstream news and then just go on about their daily lives, like all of those, so many people have very strongly held views on every topic that there is. It's almost like people feel an obligation to have a strong view on any topic. And perhaps that is because that is how you end up constructing your worldview. But you scratch the surface a little bit by saying like, okay, well, what makes you think that your view on that issue is valid, or your perspective on that is valid? And again, usually when you press a little bit like that, you find there's been very little proof of work, very little attempt to actually make sure that view is validly held. It's just been adopted by someone that they might trust, or someone that they think is similar to them in a certain capacity. And so people are walking around with these perspectives that are so inadequately and poorly and lack the work to be constituted properly, or at least optimally.
They are retweets, right? They're they're
right.
Essentially retweets, right? They're not original thought.
Mm-hmm.
No, and you're right. And that's a scary thing when you think of the mass number of people who are essentially thought retweeters. I mean, because there's so little critical thinking or original thought. And I'm sure you'll like one day the narrative went from COVID to Ukraine. I remember that day, I was like, what are you doing? Like, do you give up the sovereignty of your brain so easily? Are you just like, download the latest story into my brain? I give you free permission to control my emotions and my thoughts. I mean, it was like that. And I just thought it was scary, actually, to think that people are so easily willing to give up the sovereignty of what's in their head. I don't let anybody put stuff in my head unless I want it in there. Mm-hmm. And I think the world would be a better place if we were more diligent keepers of the ground of our mind. Like,
I couldn't agree
like,
more.
like we gotta, you have to before I'm going to let you in to my view, you don't just walk in here because, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I think it's almost like what we're describing is like, what is the filter, right? So you get data from the world, be it from the TV or from your interactions or from whatever. What is the filter that it passes through to be valid, perspective constructing information to you in your mind? And, broadly speaking, I think, and it's not that this even has to have been malicious, although it's definitely, I think, taken advantage of in today's world, but like the data that becomes the most attractive or valuable to the most people is the data that's figured out what that filter is, because it can more easily go in. And so when you look at, let's just pick an easy target here and say mainstream media, long time ago, it was determined that like to get through that filter, okay, you need someone who's dressed well on TV, someone who doesn't use extreme language, someone whose emotions are in control all the time, someone who speaks at a certain cadence, someone who, has the requisite background to convey authority, someone who's parameterized by dramatic music in between what they're saying, someone who's backed up by the legitimacy of the brand and how that brand is associated with the state. And,
yeah,
all those multitude of factors have meant that, okay, right through the front gates, like those have become, those tick the boxes on the filter. But I think what many of us well, you and I and Bitcoiners broadly speaking, and many besides, are starting to say, no, like those aren't the things that get through my filter anymore. Like, because I've determined that those things, they let in too much things that aren't actually true just by virtue of the fact that they cohere or conform to what the filters that have been established. So now we're creating new filters. And like we said about Andreas right at the beginning, like didn't understand all the things that he was saying technically, but something about his way of delivery, I could sense a sincerity, which allowed me to open the filter a little bit and say, okay, like I'll let this information come in for now. I'm going to keep watching you. And if you do anything that, I'm going to keep observing you. And that might mean the filter gets closed off to you in the future. And then the data that got in as a result of it being open has to be taken out and tested again and scrutinized again. Right. But I mean, this is the process, right? Like what are we looking for to construct that filter to determine which data we should let in and which data we should not let in or get out?
Yeah. I like the word sincerity as a new filter, because if someone is sincere, like I find Jordan Peterson to be very sincere. If someone is sincere, because you can just sniff bullshit, right? You can just tell if someone's selling something or
well,
if,
you can, but so many people still can't, unfortunately.
Well, like if there's an ego that's trying to survive through what they're trying to do, but sincerity is a great filter, I think, because even if the sincere person, and this is where, compassion is a useful tool to have in your toolkit. Even if you're talking to someone who has retweet views, but they're sincere, then that's a nice invitation to engage and be like, oh, okay, and then perhaps make headway with that person, or make headway with, within yourself from what that person has to offer.
Yeah.
But you're right, these old paradigm formats of the broadcast news and the pancake makeup, no.
Well, I mean, it leads you to think like how much is just appealing to the filter versus how much is actual useful data for the construction of a truthful perspective. And I think, look at Rogan, right? Like his viewership is like 10 times or 20 times CNN, something like that. And I think most people would admit it's not that you agree with everything Rogan says. It's not that you take everything Rogan says as gospel, but to your point, I think what you do know is he's not trying to manipulate you. He's being blatantly himself, and he's asking questions. And some of those questions you would have asked too, and other ones you wouldn't have. But at least you know he's not appealing to your filter to sneak something in. You know that he's just, boom, laid bare. And it just so happens that he's an inquisitive and eloquent and curious guy. And to the extent that you're curious, that is useful for your own ends. But with the existing, mainstream paradigm, all they're trying to do is appeal to that future, to the extent that I think so many of us now are like, you're too good at appealing like to the normal filter tick boxes that I don't know what you're actually trying to get in there, get in under the radar, as it were. And as a result, there's just such an extreme distrust, that's being formed around those things, because saying, no, not sincere enough. You need to come at me with, I want you to speak like plainly. I want you to look plainly. I want you to be here for your ends. This is what I think this is an interesting development in our notion of bias in media. And I think by virtue of the fact that now everyone can be a source of media, let's say, because everyone can broadcast themselves to millions of people. I think that because maybe when there was only like 3 news companies or news channels or whatever, maybe attempting to be unbiased was a virtue because you wanted to try to you wanted to try to share information without a bias. But I think what a lot of people are recognizing these days is there's no such thing. You're going to have a bias one way or the other, and it may be subtle and it may not be obvious, but it's going to permeate that filter in some way. And so in this new paradigm, I think the best way to approach it is to recognize and accept and lean into your bias and basically say, this is the way the world looks, or this is the way I'm construing the information based on the bias that I think is most valid. Yes, of course I have a bias. I think, I believe in these things more than those things. And now you have a multitude of options, so you can balance the biases off each other to try to come to what you think is most true for your perspective, not like just trying to force everyone into some false notion of objectivity. Because then we get things like #science and #trust Fauci, as if that's just an eternal, inarguable truth, which is of course absurd.
Yeah. And when you were describing the differences between Rogan and like mainstream broadcast, I just had this horrible thought of some like internal meeting at NBC, like, oh, we have to come up with a new look, someone who's more authentic, and we'll be able to smell that too, because you can't fake authenticity. But you're right. I guess if you can own your bias and be I'm just trying to figure out if you can own your bias, and I guess that's an authentic way to do it, is lay your biases bare so that there's no hidden agenda, and then at least your biases can be poked at, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because there is no perspective without a bias, right? You gotta, it's leaning towards one type of view, one ideology, one set of ideas, whatever. Maybe Tucker Carlson's a great example, because like he clearly has a bias toward conservatism / libertarianism / a Christian viewpoint, or whatever it ultimately is.
Right.
And he doesn't hide that. He's like, I have that bias because I believe it's valid, and here is how I'm construing the world based on that perspective and that bias. If you line up with that, you're probably gonna fit his, or the way he articulates what he's seeing in the world is sufficiently valid information that it's either going to be entertaining or otherwise useful to you in some capacity in understanding what's happening in the world. If not, you can go in search of a bias or a perspective that you think is more valid. And then, as you said, hopefully you're exposing yourself to enough that you become capable at parsing what you believe to be most true, accepting the fact that everything is ultimately going to be, subjective in a sense. And so you're going to have to commit to certain biases at some point.
Yeah, I will confess that if I see a strong bias, um, my trust level drops, and I'm less willing to do the work of listening to that person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's like if I guess an example would be like if a journalist writes an article and they call ivermectin horse dewormer, I'm like, no. Or on the other side, if some of the right wing call COVID the China virus. I don't know. It's just I'm thinking like, well, you're spinning, you're spinning, you're spinning. I
Sure,
don't want
sure.
to I don't want to weed through the spin. Like,
Mm.
so I don't know if a bias. I guess my fear would be, well, it's a fear that anyone might have, is that the bias attracts the bias, and then nothing ever gets truly, then it's just tribalism.
Sure. I think what you're saying there though is that biases can have varying degrees of egregiousness, right? Like when does a
Yes,
bias become like just a blatant either lie or a lack of sufficient research in something? I mean, I think what
right.
we're looking for is valid biases, and then it begs the question, like, well, is it right to call it a bias if you really think it's valid? Like maybe it's more akin to like an interpersonal or intersubjective truth of some kind, but of course that's hazy territory. And so
Yeah,
I'm not saying like, and I agree with you, but I think the perspective or approach that we've been espousing or exploring in this conversation thus far is meant to be the check on that very like concern or danger of just like resonating with a certain bias and giving yourself up to it, right?
right.
And as you said, like, oh yeah, like I'm just one of those people now, and whatever they say, like I'm down with that bias. I think what we're trying to say is like I mean, it's almost like you're using the bias to assess the sincerity of the person, and or assess the capacity and or the, like if Tucker were to say something about any given topic, it's not like just because he says it you're going to believe it. You're going to say, okay, he has that perspective. Why? Like what amount of work or research or contemplation did he put into developing that? And based on my observation of those things, how much should it spur me on to validate it myself? Maybe a little bit, maybe not that much. But as we've been saying, the buck always stops with us. We're
Right.
just we're taking in all this data and trying to figure out which is the best data to be working with. And then once, if it's crossed that barrier of sincerity or truthfulness, because so much out there is just blatant, lies of various forms. But if it's actually
Yeah,
people being honest about what they're perceiving, well, then we can kind of work with that data and we can say, well, how much does it resonate with our own perspective, and and how do we want to use it as a
yeah.
result?
I guess what's frustrating to me is, like, I've heard Tucker Carlson say really valid things, but it's sort of like packaged in that bias, right?
Sure.
And so,
He's a
like my
TV show
left,
host.
yeah, well, my lefty friends, let's call them. So it prevents that information from ever getting to them,
Right.
because they won't even, they that's just a dead end. So we just create, like, I just wish there were people, um, you know, people with no identity that, well, I guess Joe Rogan is a good example, where I don't feel like he has, uh, I mean, like you said, he probably has his own biases, but he's not politically affiliated, or, so I think that's really helpful to society at large. Um, but at least now, I will, you know, painfully listen to a Tucker Carlson thing, um, just because I've seen evidence that there is truth being presented
Mm.
from those sources that I formerly would have rejected outright.
Yeah. And I think that's the right approach, and
Yeah,
also, first of all, two things with Rogan. One, I think you're right that he's in this gray area where he's like, he fails to commit. I'm not a libertarian. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Muslim. Like, he's just in this, it's hard to nail him down, which is part
yeah,
of the reason why they've gone to such great lengths recently to destroy him, I think, because it's like, we can't have someone who is like, you can't put in a
neutral.
box and can't neutralize in some
Yeah,
way. We've got to get rid of him. He's messing everything up. But I also think, what's the difference between preferences and a bias? Or, where do preferences come from if they don't come from some type of leaning or bias at somewhere up the chain? Like, these things come from somewhere. And I don't know. I think, maybe we've beaten this one down enough, but I think it's better to be upfront about what your current beliefs are and what your current preferences are, and present the world to whoever's listening to you through that lens. Be upfront about it, and then you just let them do with that information what you
right.
will. Like, I like watching Tucker Carlson because I think it's entertaining. I know
Yeah,
he's a TV show host. I know he's dramatizing things. I know a 30-minute or however long the show is insufficient to cover in depth such big, like,
yes,
events that he's covering. But in the realm of mainstream media, where there's so little truthful analysis, or again, what resonates as truth to me of what's going on, it's refreshing to see someone even address the topics and issues that seem to be getting ignored by everybody else. And so,
yeah,
like, if I want to be, for me, it's mostly entertainment. I'm not thinking like I'm getting any great
yeah,
insight or perspective or information from Tucker, but to watch him get up there and laugh at the absurdity of so much of what's going on, it's kind of fun, you know?
yeah. Agreed. Totally agreed. And people have to have a sense of humor. God, come on.
Well, that's the other thing. Everyone's so fucking serious,
I
We're all gonna
know.
die.
I know. We are gonna die. Woo!
But I mean, so back to your story. Bitcoin came on the scene 2 years ago, but you mentioned like 5 years ago, like, being called a Republican would have been something you would take offense to. So what was it that allowed you to transcend this rigid view and like this polarity that we've been exploring and ascribing to certain biases, and become, for lack of a better term, more of a free thinker?
So it started with, Bitcoin, understanding Bitcoin, but then going into the more philosophical aspects of Bitcoin, free markets. So, like I might have been one of those people that are like, oh yeah, capitalism is so bad or something, but, and I have, there's these people that rant about, capitalism and it's so evil or whatever. And I don't think they even know what that is. And I mean, what is that? And also there's, I'm sure Jeff Booth would tell you, there's no free capitalism. Everything is just so manipulated and fucked up with. So, but back to your question. So, just like digging into that, and then thinking like, oh, wow. I actually had this goofy thing happen with me and my nieces at Christmas, where we got a bunch of stickers, and like my sister gave us these bags of stickers. They're just like logos of stuff. And I sat down with my niece, and she had a bag of stickers, and I was like, I don't really like these stickers. Do you want them? And she's like, oh yeah, I want the Harley Davidson sticker. And then she was like, I don't really want these. So we traded. So the point of my story is that we traded, and I was like, oh my God, now I have all these things that I want.
I'm a filthy capitalist.
And she has all the things that she wants. So both of us are better off for having traded. Like, I know it sounds silly, but it was really a beautiful thing where, like, there was free will, right? I didn't give her something unless I thought, well, I can get this in return. But at the end of the transaction, I had way better stickers and she had way better stickers. So that's actually a really powerful teaching point, that when humans gather, and because we have different wants and needs, and we can, share those different wants and needs and exchange different wants and needs in a free flowing way, we all get happier. Mm-hmm. So it's an additive thing. So anyway, I mean, it's obviously, your question is hard to give you the play by play of how I got there. Mm. But essentially, it's a combination of understanding more about, incentives, game theory, and the beauty of free trade between individuals, and diving into the delusion of the mainstream narrative. So it's like a firestorm of inquiry that I engaged in that's brought me to nowhere. But being nowhere is better than being tribally attached to a delusion.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I've heard this story so many times now, which is why I mean, maybe struggle to find the words, but I think it's beautiful, because what it sounds like is, again, what we've been discussing, where you're letting go of a lot of stuff in order to come to a greater appreciation or a greater approximation of something more true than what you were using to orient you before, and It's kind of like you already mentioned in this conversation, the term, like, I saw the light, and so many of us have, and it invokes this theological or religious language so often, because it feels like that. It's like, wow, I can't believe that I was seeing things that way before. I was blind, but now I see, or at least now I'm starting to see. And you talk to these people, and it's almost like their eyes are wider, and they're engaging on such different terms, and their facial expressions are different. Like when you're talking to a Bitcoiner versus someone who's quote unquote ideologically possessed, I mean, everything is different, the mannerisms and the facial expressions and everything. And it's really interesting. And to your point about that simple example, I think what, I have been a big fan of Terence McKenna for a long time, and I've told the story on the podcast before, but he used to say, and he would definitely be classified as like a lefty, broadly speaking, although I hate to pigeonhole him like that. But, he used to say that culture is not your friend. And I think his critique was valid insofar as a critique of our current culture, whereby, as we've been discussing, it's constituted on such false, perverse, corrupt signals that what it's generating is a people and a landscape of options that are not optimized. We can do better, right? And obviously what we've been discussing is how Bitcoin allows us to see how much better that it can be. But that's the point, is that it's not that culture itself is not your friend. It's that a corrupt or a culture predicated on corruption or on, false signals can be far more dangerous and detrimental than one that's constituted on truth and truthful and pristine signals. And so what I'm excited about is that if Bitcoin truly is the mechanism that allows that to happen, that little example you gave with the exchange of stickers, whereby you both worked with the constituents of the environment to tease out of it what is most valuable. And so you got what is most valuable to you, and she got what is most valuable to her because of your cooperation in conjunction with that environment. And so you blow that up to a cultural level, and those things, the values that you're trying to tease out of that environment end up becoming culture, right? And so if we can engage in that process where there's no false information, where there's no corruption, then what we end up doing is we interact with one another and we interact with the natural world to extract out, through our infinite number of exchanges, what is most valuable. And I think that means that in the future,
it's a flourishing.
Yeah, well, exactly. And we're going to be able to better answer those eternal questions of what is the most valuable thing? What is the highest principle? What is God like, and how is it going to be represented in the things that we build into the culture by virtue of how we extract them both from it and ourselves? And
Right.
who knows what answers that's going to conjure up, because we've never had such a pristine basis by which to engage in those exchanges that elicit those answers. And so I think
Right.
culture can be your friend and is very, very valuable and important, because culture is just the result of those interactions between each other. It just has to be constituted properly.
Right. And it's like the freeway of that interaction has to be open. And so that's what, no, it's really cool. That sticker trade was like an example that maybe Jeff Booth talks about of abundance was created for both of us through the exchange.
Well, yeah. And not even abundance, but like, and just permit me to perhaps be a little bit, I'm on this bent lately, so maybe I'm seeing things too much through this lens, but like that exchange is the first step toward finding God, in my opinion, because what you're doing is what's the highest value that you hold internally? It's the thing that most orients you. It's the thing that you believe is most validly to be oriented by, the thing that's most valid to sacrifice your limited resources for, right? And I think that
right.
that is kind of the notion of God, but you're using that exchange and all the different exchanges you have to continuously aspire toward that. You're saying I'm continuously using these exchanges of my own limited resources to aspire increasingly towards what I perceive to be the highest value. And I think that is kind of one's relationship to the notion of God is the highest value. And so I'm engaging in all these different exchanges of my limited self to discern that better. And the better that those exchanges can be constituted with as little friction, with as little distortion, with as little exogenous information involved as possible, the more able I am to engage in that process. And over the course of time and over the course of millions or billions of exchanges, I'm inching closer to what I deem to be the highest value, the value that most orients me, the value that's most worthy of my sacrifice.
The grand elevation, right? To the
right. And so that little
golden
tiny
trumpet
exchange of your favorite stickers is an expression of you inching toward greater and greater and greater value as far as you are able to conceive it or how it's constructed internally for you.
That's a cool thing to chew on. Is like the alignment of a material value, like that I value the stickers, and a spiritual value. And maybe what you're suggesting is that as the free flow of value is created in the material world, so too can the free flow in the spiritual world of
well, I don't think
elevated.
I don't think they're really that separate. The reason why you value the stickers is because they're resonating or speaking to something internally that you value, right? And so this is why I often use the language that culture is kind of just the externalization of our own consciousness. And to the extent that we have clarity around the things that we believe to be most valuable internally, again, somewhat dramatically speaking, your own relationship to the highest value or God, that is the kind of the output that is culture. Those are the inputs of the output that is culture. And of course, it's a constant feedback loop between the two.
Right.
And if it can be constructed via an incorruptible mechanism of exchanging those values, which of course we've never had, but if that is the case now, then that feedback loop by which we continuously refine our relationship to that which we deem to be most valuable should be optimized. And that's really really cool, because that means that we might be able to in a better position to discern what is of the highest value. And we may be in a better position to manifest it in the world via free will and voluntary cooperation. And it invokes notions of the kingdom of God, for example, to use again dramatic or narrative language.
Wow, that's intense. I like that. Yeah, that I'm going to sit with that for a while, because no, because you're basically picking apart why do we value something? We value something because of a spiritual sense of right. Yeah, that's really cool.
I mean, like ultimately it tracks back up to there, right? You can have intermediate values that get you there, right? Like, your desire for the food may not have anything to do with God. It's like, well, I'm hungry and I have a physiological need, but somewhere along that line, it's like, well, I'm attempting to persist through the nourishment. What am I persisting for? What am I trying to
Right.
persist toward? And so
Yeah. What am I
think
feeding?
yeah, so it's all
Literally.
connected in that way. And again, if we truly have a mechanism for pristinely communicating what we find in each of our pursuits in that domain, then I think we dramatically accelerate our ability to to gain clarity around those things for ourselves, because so much of our own perception of ourselves and our own understanding of things is in relationship to the social and natural worlds in which we exist. And then the greater capacity to bring them about in the material or interpersonal or manifest or phenomenal world as a result of what kind of cooperation this thing facilitates.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. That's like, whoa, it's early on a Monday morning I really appreciate that, though. I'm going to marinate on that one.
Yeah, well, I've been marinating on it for a while. So, and it's a tough one to wrap your head around, because the implications are it's hard to figure out what the implications are. This is kind of why there's so much mind blowing going on in this space and these pursuits these days.
So just a couple of practical things. I don't know if you can hear, but the machines have showed up at my condo building. So there's a lot of noise going on here right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to get to work. But I was going to ask you if we could wrap this up. But
Sure.
I wanted to ask you for a book recommendation for a pleb at my place in the ladder. I like to think we're all on this ladder.
Yeah.
And there's people below us and there's people above us. So in terms of like your philosophical dancing around this subject, do you have a book that you think has really helped encourage that kind of thinking?
I mean, there's definitely been the one that comes to mind. Have you read Maps of Meaning by Peterson?
No.
So
I've circled around it. I've been interested in it.
Yeah, I mean, it by no means. It's been influential. I'll put it that way. And the way in which it's been influential has been in allowing me to see, and at least from my perspective, extract more insight and wisdom from religious narrative, broadly speaking. And
Okay.
with perhaps more of a focus on Christianity, but in the book he goes into Sumerian, Egyptian, all that kind of stuff, and to really see to this point about to gain more of a broader perspective and maybe a deeper perspective on what value is, how it operates, how we engage it, how it orients us. That book is like a masterwork at using religious narrative to explicate our relationship to value and meaning, basically. And so that's been, I've read it twice. I think it's almost 500 pages, and it's a challenging read because every single line has a lot of thought put into it. Like Peterson has mentioned many times that he's like written and rewritten every line in that book 10 or 20 times. And so it can be a slow read, but a tremendously rewarding one for me.
Okay. Thank you for that.
What about you before I let you go? What kind of book rec do you have?
Well, I feel like I'm playing catch up to all you Bitcoiners. So um, I've actually just bought Atlas Shrugged. I don't know if you've read that, but
I actually haven't.
okay. So I just love that there's this bizarre woman that everyone thinks is one of the greatest writers, American writers, and I think she was Polish. So I'm just really curious, like, well, what's this Ayn Rand all about? And um, so that's kind of where I'm going
Cool.
as my
Well, you'll
next
have
book
next
thing.
time we speak, you'll have to tell me your thoughts. I mean, obviously, a lot of Bitcoiners love that book, and a lot of kind of individualist, libertarian types love that book. I struggle a lot with fiction, which is why I haven't gotten through it yet. But I'll have to
Yeah,
bite the bullet at some point.
I agree. And I remember you said you struggled with fiction when you were talking about the mandibles, when you guys were having your mandibles talk. That
Mhm.
was kind of a fun book to read. I did read the
Yeah, it was.
mandibles.
It
It was
was.
like,
I enjoyed it.
holy shit. It
I
was,
mean, particularly because you look at the world, because how interesting would it have been even in 2016 when it came out? Probably way
I
less, right?
know. Nobody, how, like, it was so prescient. I don't know. It was just so bizarre to,
Yeah.
to, to think about the year that it was written.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. It was a cool book though. Anyways, Liam, I appreciate the time, man. It's been great to connect and chat a bit. I'll
Yeah.
let you get back to your day, and I'm sure we'll speak again in the future.
Thank you, John. And I'm really going to work on this last chunk that you left me with about the the uh, the free value generation aspects of this whole thing and how that can get us to the golden trumpets, as it were.
Well, hit me up if you have any special insights, because I'm always looking to refine my own understanding of it all.
Right on.
All right, brother. Take care.
Thanks again.